knowledge. So much of what I'll share today is based on my own experience and interpretations of some of the guidance. And I do welcome all of you to share alternative approaches during our discussion. On the agenda for today is a very brief materiality refresher, and then we'll jump into some upsides and potential pitfalls of double materiality under ESRS, and we'll round out the presentation portion with some strategic considerations before jumping into Q&A. So to make sure we're all on the same page, there are three approaches to materiality in sustainability. Impact materiality, which of course revolves around the effects a company has on the world. Financial materiality, which considers conditions that have significant financial effects on companies. And double materiality, which combines the two perspectives. The Global Reporting Initiative, the GRI, has been the leading standard, taking the impact materiality approach for more than 2 decades. Sorry, Nancy, did you want to hop in?
No, that's okay. The slide didn't advance. I got it to advance. It was my issue. I'm so sorry. Please continue.
About it at all. That's fine. So the GRI has been the leading standard, taking that impact materiality approach. Though arguably not many companies have actually followed GRI's materiality guidance to a T, and I think companies have certainly struggled with prioritizing topics across social and environmental themes. And the approach to topic prioritization has probably historically been a little bit too subjective. And then we have SASB along with TCFD, now in the form of 2 ISSB standards, IFRS S1 and S2, covering financial materiality. And although this is supposed to be about financial effects on companies, looking at dozens of SASB and TCFD reports, the actual quantification of financial effects remains challenging for a lot of companies, probably with the exception of a lot of companies in the finance sector. Some of the differences with ESRS are the explicit requirement for severity assessments of impacts, risks, and opportunities over different time horizons. Also, the focus on generating a comprehensive list of topics rather than the focus on a prioritized list. And I'll note that obviously companies should still prioritize topics because you can benefit from that strategically. And then there's also the emphasis on thresholds. And ESRS also stresses the importance of objectivity over subjectivity, the dynamic nature of materiality, and the importance of process, documentation, and disclosure. And hopefully that was enough for just a refresh. So we'll dive into some of the upsides of doing double materiality assessments. So a rather obvious opportunity lies in embracing the guidance around time horizons, which also aligns with the concept of dynamic materiality. And dynamic materiality is really just about keeping up with changes in the external environment and changing stakeholder expectations in real time, and maintaining the flexibility to adjust your strategy accordingly. Conducting your severity assessment within each time horizon, short, medium, and long term, can also help identify risks and opportunities that are likely to either escalate or drop over time. And that allows you to explore whether this trajectory is aligned or at odds with your broader business strategy. And I'll come back to this when we touch on strategic considerations, because I think this area of tension will definitely cause some discussions, maybe some headaches as more companies embark on their DMA journeys. Another area of opportunity is enhanced stakeholder engagement. I hope at this point we can all agree that sending a list of sustainability topics to 2,000 people with no sustainability background and having them decide whether climate change or human rights are more important is not the best way to spend your stakeholders' time or our time. But if we're seeking out experts to help us determine if an impact is reversible or not, for instance, or maybe illustrate how specific decarbonization efforts may adversely impact certain segments of the community, or maybe aid us in identifying social norms or standards that we can use as thresholds to objectively evaluate our performance, is a much better use of our time. And when we build these networks of diverse, knowledgeable, interested parties, it also makes sense to keep the conversation going instead of just seeking them out every 3 years or so. And of course, DMAs encourage proactive risk management. If we're looking at impacts, risks, and opportunities, or IROs, in the medium and long term, in addition to the short term, we can predict and mitigate risks and pursue opportunities much sooner. And this is especially true if double materiality assessments or DMAs are not managed in a silo. So if you can kind of rope in your functional departments into the DMA process, of course, with periodic cross-functional information sharing, you really increase the chances of detecting risks and opportunities early and identify those cross-functional risks and opportunities and also get ahead of your impacts. I will be the last person to pretend that in the wake of ESRS, your materiality assessments or the reporting process will now suddenly be streamlined. I don't think this will be the case. I think we all feel that there's more work to do now. And I think after years of hearing about interoperability and harmonization, some of us are maybe justifiably a little bit skeptical. It's also important to acknowledge that mandated reporting is not like voluntary reporting. For instance, we know that many GRI in accordance reports that are out in the public sphere have not actually met GRI's in accordance requirements. So the added level of scrutiny from a mandated framework will probably result in a lot of sustainability reporters scrutinizing and possibly overanalyzing their own reports. So I've still listed this as an opportunity because I essentially see ESRS, double materiality, as an opportunity to get both strategy and reporting right. And I'd really urge companies to, instead of just trying to get this over with, to recognize the value of taking that deep dive and to spend the time to consult with knowledgeable stakeholders in a targeted way to adopt that dynamic materiality approach across many functions and to be thoughtful and transparent about that process. I think when it's done right, the ESRS DMA approach will eventually absorb GRI and ISSB materiality approaches, as well as various due diligence regulations. And it'll benefit investors by facilitating that comparison between company approaches globally, while also encouraging the expansion of enterprise risk management programs to include a much broader set of ESG risks than what we're seeing right now. And let's hop into some potential pitfalls or challenges. So I've just gushed about the potential benefits of spending that time to do a proper DMA, but I'll now add that caveat to know when to stop. I think one of the pitfalls of ESRS aligned DMA is that it's easy to kind of get carried away with both designing a robust process and also the number of IROs, especially when we start working through numerous supply chain tiers and looking at dependencies and trying to estimate the effects of not just actual but potential IROs. Just one small way to make our lives easier in that regard is also to avoid creative names for material topics, which, is something that's been happening for a really long time. But standardizing terminology can be helpful here. So using existing topic names from the standards and just common clear names for your IROs to streamline the process and prevent having to map back and forth when your disclosures, you know, for your topics don't really match the topic definitions used by the standards. The other area of complexity I want to briefly mention is disaggregation of data. And disaggregation is required when you identify kind of one-off IROs that are material. And this could happen due to, specific facility or regional activity. And generally, our goal is to consolidate our IROs, but we don't want to dilute any that are, very specific and might get lost in kind of the broader score. So breaking out data for that facility or activity or region can be necessary, and that might translate into having to revise some of our data tools to allow for these breakouts. Another potential pitfall is subjectivity and inconsistency. ESRS emphasizes objectivity in DMAs. I think at least for now, as we get started, subjectivity is somewhat unavoidable. Our stakeholders add perspective. There's regional and company context that can be very nuanced and needs to be interpreted by internal stakeholders. We also know that, scenario analysis is an input into double materiality, since we have to look at these various time horizons and think about plausible futures. And there really is no way to produce an entirely objective scenario analysis that I've seen so far. And when you assess the severity of impacts, there will also be judgment calls, which is why context is so important within ESRS. So let's say you've identified an impact that is, maybe technically remediable, but it's cost prohibitive to reverse it. So now you have to decide, am I going to call this remediable for the purpose of my severity assessment and add context about remediation being very unlikely, or do I call it irremediable with, adding context that it's technically remediable or in theory remediable. And there are also impacts that are partially remediable. And how do we determine the percentage of restoration at which we deem the impact to be reversed? So especially on the impact side, there will be subjectivity and judgment calls. And the remedy is to just be very generous with context, especially if we don't have access to experts we can consult on these issues. Another challenge, though I consider this to be minor relative to some of the others, is that ESRS is still in its early stages. So not only are the standards likely to evolve over time, but the planned sector standards will add another dimension that we need to be ready for. And one way we can prepare for this is to consider existing sector standards, such as those of GRI, when developing that initial universe of potentially material topics. And of course, I'll have to mention greenwashing, which is as old as reporting standards themselves. Emissions are oftentimes not properly explained. And generally, this hasn't been a high risk for companies with voluntary reporting. With ESRS, it's a little different. I suspect that conversations about what must be disclosed based on topics and IROs identified during the double materiality process might in some instances increase the internal tension. And to add to this, unlike many companies used to do with GRI material topic lists, when you have that validation meeting and, the executive leadership team could make a decision to remove some of those topics. But if you do that with ESRS DMA, you'll just throw off your entire methodology. So it's really important to vet the process early on, including setting that expectation that you have to report all identified topics that fall above the threshold. And now I'll just talk quickly about some strategies for effective double materiality assessment. I've alluded to developing a robust internal process already, but there are two areas I'd like to highlight. And the first is oversight. The governance bodies overseeing sustainability, including materiality assessments and reporting, are supposed to have sufficient knowledge to make informed decisions. And what we've seen in many cases is that no one on the board and, pretty frequently, no one on the executive leadership team has actually acquired that level of knowledge. And the other area related to that is knowledge and participation across the organization. A lot of companies are tasking sustainability teams, sometimes even individual sustainability contributors, and I've been there, to perform materiality assessments A through Z. And in my view, this is a really poor use of sustainability teams because it's not possible for us to learn enough about each functional area to comprehensively capture all potentially relevant IROs. Most of us are pretty good at what we do, but we're not all-knowing magicians. So a better way to leverage the sustainability team is for building that internal capacity across all the different functions to help functional leaders to identify IROs themselves and to know when stakeholder interactions should become inputs into the materiality assessment process. So in other words, sustainability teams are best positioned to prepare functional leaders for ongoing participation in a dynamic materiality process. The next one is workstream optimization. During your first couple of cycles of performing double materiality assessments, maybe set aside some time for data gap assessments. For instance, if impacts emerge that require disaggregated data reporting, set up the process to collect the data in that format in the future. Or let's say you're withdrawing water for your operations and you want to use the UNRISD Sustainable Development Performance Indicator for water withdrawals to gauge whether water withdrawals are a material impact. You can't really do that until you know whether your withdrawal rate is below the replenishment rate. So you may need to commission, a water source vulnerability assessment. So in essence, your DMA process can yield this to-do list that will make your future DMAs much more robust and objective. Another strategy for optimizing is to map your DMA process steps to requirements in other regulations, like CS3D, for example. The objective is really to figure out how small alterations to your process can cover or help you prepare for as many regulations as possible. And that's the beginning of that harmonization we're all looking for. We've talked about stakeholders, and one thing that I've always found helpful in GRI reports is the section on stakeholder engagements, where many of us have listed stakeholder activity tables outlining how we've engaged with stakeholders throughout the year and at what intervals. I think this continues to be useful and can be integrated into maybe a broader, more detailed stakeholder consultation process or communications plan. The one thing I'd recommend, though, is not to just have a category for employees, but to break out the specific employee segments you're engaging with and for what purpose. And this goes back to that organization-wide competency and having functional leaders support dynamic materiality. And keep your approach to stakeholder engagement dynamic too. Engagement should be consistent, but just as your IROs will change over time, so should your stakeholders. For instance, if the management of an impact becomes really sophisticated over time, you may require a higher level of expertise to identify further actions. And kind of a given transparency and accountability. Obviously, be transparent about the methodology used for materiality assessments, including and maybe especially around setting thresholds and the assumptions that underlie them. So one thing we need to keep in mind is that these disclosures will get a lot of attention initially because everyone is really curious about how everyone else approached this, and analysts will want to parse out best practices too. So being explicit and logical and open about uncertainty and gaps can help prevent any criticism. And of course, with the added scrutiny that comes along with mandated versus voluntary reporting, be diligent with internal quality controls and obviously seeking assurance in alignment with ESRS requirements. And finally, just a few recommendations I want to highlight for the path forward. One is balancing rigor with practicalities. We should aim to balance this rigorous process that is double materiality assessment with the practical realities of our business, the deadlines we have to meet, the resources we have available to us. Part of that is knowing when to stop identifying IROs and not getting into that rabbit hole. And just not letting the process paralyze us. If we go into this kind of expecting imperfection early on, and maybe take comfort in how much you'll be able to take away from the process when it's done right. The other one is rethinking familiar approaches. It's really tempting to recycle what we've been doing for many years, but it's unlikely to move us forward. And our environment has certainly changed since we first started doing materiality assessments. One glaring example I can think of that, in my opinion, has provided very little value and has caused a lot of headaches in the past is the materiality matrix. And so I'm really thrilled to see the alternative ways in which companies are now presenting material topics. So let's think about how we can best leverage this process for the practical and actionable outcomes that we really need right now. And lastly, embracing strategic value. Like I said, when implemented effectively, double materiality can provide strategic value, drive sustainable growth and resilience in this very rapidly changing world. and be open to conversations about the tension that might arise when evaluating IROs against existing business objectives. I think these are difficult conversations to have because they raise questions like, is there something about our business that is inherently unsustainable? Are we creating a lot of irremediable impacts? And if so, are there alternatives we can explore? And if not, do we need to reevaluate our business model? And if that's not an option, how will we talk about these business activities in the public? And some of you might be cringing at the thought of having these discussions, but it's really much better to have them internally now to prepare for when external stakeholders start asking them. And I have little doubt that they will if the increase in recent sustainability related reporting mandates is any indication. And that is it for the presentation portion.